Hey guys, it's Dollipop. I am here with another installment of my tutorial series. This month I am teaching you guys how to draw and color a stylized peacock, which sounds kind of random, but when I drew this girl, I just really saw her with a peacock on her shoulder. So yeah, and with my tutorials, I kind of like to figure out new techniques and then teach them to you guys. So one of my goals lately has been trying to draw more stylized animals, kind of trying to figure out how different animals would look in my style. So, hence the peacock. But yeah, so I'm just starting with doing like a little rough sketch. You can kind of see before that I had a very rough sketch, and I originally wanted the peacock to have like a little collar as well, but I decided to omit it later. Also I kind of forgot, but I think it would have been too much anyway. But yeah, so and now I'm just kind of like doing the line art. So a couple brief little things I wanted to talk about. I will probably eventually do a tutorial specifically on how to stylize animals. But just a couple little notes while I ink is I opted to kind of keep the lines very fluid, very simple. I didn't want to make anything too textured. I didn't want to draw a lot of individual feathers, although I did end up drawing a couple little individual feathers, but I knew that I wanted to apply a lot of texture and shading. And when I draw human figures, though I do a fair amount of detail lines, I don't really draw every single feature and every single part. So I wanted to have kind of the shading of the feathers take a lot of the detail. So I just kind of drew, I definitely looked at reference pictures both before and while I was drawing. I decided to use like my normal kind of line art then coloring technique for the body of the peacock. I almost said penguin. For the body of the peacock. But then you'll see here in a second, I decided to kind of figure out my own technique for doing these long tail feathers because I did not want to sit around and individually render every single feather. So this tutorial is basically going to go over how I did that effect by kind of using technology to your advantage. This tutorial is for Photoshop. It relies on the stroke function quite a bit. You can do these techniques without access to the stroke function. Like I know I'm almost 100% positive that Procreate does not have a stroke yet. I don't use Procreate, so I'm not positive. It may have come out with Procreate 5, but I don't think it did. So basically, I've probably said this before, but a stroke is a layer style that you can apply to a layer that makes a line around everything. I use it a lot for things that need to have even lines that don't require a lot of line weight. So I'll never use it for like a person's features or anything, but if I'm doing like small jewelry or sometimes plant stems, stuff like that, then I will absolutely use the stroke tool to my advantage. So we're about to start using it now. So first thing I'm going to do after I finish inking this peacock is I'm going to create a new layer with a stroke around it. And I decided to kind of do a few different layers of feathers. So this is me just kind of adjusting the positioning. But so as you can see, I made a new layer with a stroke, and I'm just going to be drawing some, I called them stems, even like with little quotes, because I didn't really know, like, it's not the stem of a feather, but you know, like the stem of a feather basically. So I drew a couple of those, and as you can see, using the stroke tool just makes it have that like nice little perfect line where you don't have to deal with getting the lines exact or whatever. After I did those, on a new layer, I decided to draw one of the little eye feathers. I duplicate this eye feather for all of the different feathers that I put on him because, as I said, I did not want to waste my time rendering a bunch of feathers. If you have a more realistic style, it may be better to render, you know, feathers individually, but for my more cartoonish style, I felt that kind of using a clone of the feathers would be faster and kind of more in keeping with my style, actually. So as you can see, I'm using a mix of soft and hard brushes just to kind of give this feather some texture. And since I am duplicating it, I wanted to kind of take my time with it, give it a bit of detail. I used the stroke again on the feather, as you can see, because I didn't want to have to draw a line art and then color it in. If you are using Procreate or a like another program that cannot do strokes, all you have to do is just do the line art and then do the color on the layer before. So as you can see, I duplicated that little feather and I put it on the tips of all of the strands. The next thing I did was I made a new layer called Stems 2, and I did kind of the same exact thing. So I made the little stems with strokes, I added a little bit of shading to them, and then I duplicated that feather again and made it smaller. And then I placed these slightly smaller feathers at the tips of all of the stems that I made. So as you can see, they are exact duplicates of each other, but by putting them at different angles and by making each group smaller than the last, it gives it the kind of illusion of a little bit of variation. So now I'm going to be doing it a third time, making all my stems and then applying a tiny bit of shading to the stems just with one darker color, since I knew it wasn't really going to be a focus of the piece, that they were going to be mostly covered with feathers. Then again, I'm making it even smaller, and then I'm taking these little feathers and I'm putting them at the tips of the long feather strands. So, and as you can see, varying the angles kind of makes them look more unique and more individual. If you wanted to, you could even kind of adjust the sizing even more, where some of them were larger than others, but I decided not to. So the next thing is to kind of blend this big bunch of feathers together. I decided to do some filler. So just with a hard brush on another stroke layer, see, I use the stroke thing a lot, I just kind of made shapes behind the peacock and then added some very simple shading. The next thing is I did kind of the same thing on top of the stems but below the feathers, and after I clean up these lines you'll be able to see me do it. Another layer with a stroke, and I applied these lines on top of the feathers. I add the stroke later, but just to kind of like fill things in a little bit more. And if you look at pictures of peacocks, they have, I swear, I'm going to say penguin one of these times, they do have like those kind of stringy feathers. So the last thing I did was I made some even smaller feathers and I kind of placed them kind of willy-nilly to fill in. So I kind of looked at the whole piece and then just kept on copying and pasting them to fill them in, changing the angles, rearranging them under each other until it looked good. So the next thing I did was I erased part of this, and I kind of go into how I did that in the Patreon exclusive part of this tutorial, which I'll get to later. But so the next thing I did was I wanted to color the actual peacock himself. So I did do kind of a mix of cell shading and painting. I am starting to slowly introduce softer elements into my art. I still consider what I do cell shading, but I have begun to kind of mix hard and soft brushes. Not a lot, only kind of where they are effective. So I don't just blend for blending's sake, but I've begun to kind of use some softer brushes for effect that kind of make the hard edges look even harder. So first I started with a map, as I always do. And now the way I'm shading this bird is I am shading it cell shade style, so kind of paying attention to light source and stuff like that. But instead of like a normal kind of edge to my shading, I am replicating the feather texture by erasing back and adding some of the original color in. The next thing I do that you can see me do here is I add in some feathers with a soft brush just for a little bit extra texture, which again is why I decided not to draw individually all these feathers. So just repeating that with more colors, doing first the cell shading and then the little soft feathers. Then I take a highlight color and I do just a couple of highlight feathers as well with a soft brush, and then eventually I do come back in with a hard brush and do some more highlights because I thought it looked a little too soft from a distance. So I decided I needed to add just a couple of bright points, kind of like additional line art. As you can see, I'm doing that now. But yeah, so then I kind of just repeat this process for the rest of the colors on the peacock. So with my green, I'm taking a darker green. adding that feathery texture and then coming in with a soft brush. So as I mentioned earlier, the Patreon exclusive tutorial aspect comes in PDF form, and it covers what you see in the video, but it also has a little bit of a bonus. It has a process image for this whole picture from start to finish, including the girl. And it also has a mini tutorial about how to combine objects into one image. So as you can kind of see, I faded from having like the tail in front of the peacock to like partially in front of and partially behind, and then you'll see in the final image the peacock himself is partially in front of the girl and partially behind. So in the PDF tutorial, I talk about how I do that with screenshots and stuff like that. I also go a bit more in depth into detail about what I'm doing in the video. And you can access that PDF for being a $5 or more patron on Patreon. So as you can see, for the tan feathers, I'm actually doing a little bit different of a technique. I opted to kind of paint them almost individually like feathers, still like a little bit messy because I didn't want it to be over rendered and overwrought. You can tell that that's kind of a theme I do sometimes, where in my art I prefer to be in control of the things that stand out, and I didn't want these feathers to be hyper realistic standing out, which is why this is a tutorial for a stylized peacock, not a realistic peacock. One of the things I always try to do with these techniques is I try to make them blend into the rest of the picture so they look natural with my style. So as you can see, I did a similar treatment to these dark blue feathers. Last thing we're going to do is we're going to cell shade the eyes and the beaks and the little plumes and stuff like that. Just kind of my normal shading technique with a few different colors and highlights. And then last but not least will be the eye. And I'm actually quite pleased with how the peacock came out. I think it's a good mix of realism and stylization. So I hope you guys also enjoy how it turned out. And if you did like it and do use it, definitely send me your results from using these techniques. I always love to see them. Apart from that, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can always follow me on Instagram if you want more of my art. Have an awesome day.